afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the room. Welcome to our conversation. Let the music ground you, and we will get started in just a moment. Well. Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. My name is Reverend Naomi Washington Leapart, and I proudly serve the city of Philadelphia as the Director of Faith-Based and Interfaith Affairs in the Mayor's Office of Public Engagement. And I want to welcome everybody in the Zoom room, everybody on social media, everybody, lottie-dottie and everybody who is here to witness what I think will be a powerful conversation. This webinar is a continuation of the effort that the Mayor's Advisory Commission on Faith-Based and Interfaith Affairs began in 2021. We would like to spark a grassroots faith-based reparations movement here in Philadelphia, the work of repair. And I'm so delighted that today we're kicking off our reparations conversation in 2021 by talking to a friend, a colleague, a comrade, Lisa Sharon Harper, and I'll give a fuller introduction of Lisa in a moment, and one of the co-chairs of our Mayor's Commission on Faith-Based and Interfaith Affairs, Lucy Duncan. So Lucy's here and Lisa is here. We want to talk about repair. And first, we got a name that something broke. Something broke. And so I'm excited again to welcome to the room author, speaker, faith leader, activist, Lisa Sharon Harper, who has written a book, just came out fresh. Now, I've got Post-it notes and all that in my book, but you go get yours, your nice clean copy. Fortune is the name of her latest book, How Race Broke My Family and the World, and How to Repair It All. Not only did Lisa write this book, but Lisa is also the president and founder of Freedom Road, which is a consulting group that creates experiences that bring people together based upon their common understandings and common commitments to making a more just world. And so Lisa has been doing this work for many years. She used to be over at Sojourners magazine. She has written for everybody and has traveled all over the world trying to spark, that's my word today, spark freedom. And so I'm excited to give Lisa the mic in a moment and let her tell you a little bit more about herself and her work. And then I'm accompanied by my comrade, my friend, Lucy Duncan, Lucy is an organizer, an anti-racist educator. Lucy's building a consulting business with her partner, Rob, and they want to support individuals, groups, collectives um, as they journey through the stages of doing racial reparative action. Um, Lucy most recently was over at American Friends Service Committee as the director of Friends Relations. And she's a book lover like me. And so she was part of uh, owned a bookstore, co-owned a bookstore, and has been telling stories for a long time. And so I'm excited to have Lucy and Lisa here. I'll just give you both a minute to say hey to everybody, and you can say anything more about yourself or about your work that you'd like to share. Lisa, why don't you go first?
Sure. Thank you so much, Reverend Naomi. This has just been an incredible month. We've dubbed it Black Fortune Month because we're not just about learning history; we're about moving us forward and moving the people of African descent in America forward, so that we can all flourish. All of us flourish together. I'm delighted to be here. I'm looking forward to the conversation. So I won't take up any more time with any bio information. We'll just have the convo.
All right, sounds good. Lucy?
I'm just grateful to be here. And Lisa, your book is like a gift of grace, and it's so beautifully told. And your stories are so inspiring. And the framework for repair that you offer is just really deep. And I'm so grateful to get to be part of this conversation with you today.
Let's start here.
Thank you.
I want to start with you, Lisa. In Fortune, you
Mhm.
spend a lot of time unpacking histories of colonization,
Yeah.
the histories of race law, particularly in Maryland.
Mhm.
Why was that important? Why was that unpacking of an initial step that can't be skipped in the
Right.
work of doing genealogies and ultimately doing repair?
Yeah, because we can't repair until we understand how it broke. We got to know how it broke. And in order to understand how it broke, you have to know what was there before it broke and what catalyzed that break. So you cannot tell the story, the real story of America or any of us Americans without first going back to the original peoples, the first nations that lived here and were here and are here still. And so when I found myself wanting to know the history of fortune, I actually had to understand the history of the Nanticoke people to understand fortune. The Fortune Game McGee, my first American land born ancestor who was not indigenous. And so when I ask that question, I find that I'm not just in the story of race, I'm in the story of colonization. And so ultimately, the break happened when that first explorer set sail from Europe with the Pope's edict in his hand. The Pope Nicholas V, who made the Edict Romanus Pontifex, which said that if they came across any land that was quote uncivilized or unchristian, then they would have the ability to claim that land for the throne and enslave its people. And I'm asking myself, well, where'd that come from? That's not in the Bible. This is the Pope giving the edict. So it turns out that he was really referencing Aristotle. So the Pope was not drawing from scripture. The Pope was drawing from Aristotle, who said if a people group shows, I mean, is dominated, is conquered, then it has shown it was created to be enslaved. That's what the Pope was drawing from, not the Bible. The first page of the scripture actually says all humanity is made in the image of God. Every last human being. To be human means to be made in the image of God. And to be made in the image of God, which is what we understand to have that inherent dignity, it also means you are created to exercise agency in the world, make decisions that shape the world. The first the fastest and surest ways to limit agency are through oppression and poverty. So when the Pope decided to issue a decree that gave permission to oppress, what the Pope, the head of the church at that time, was saying, you have the permission to crush the image of God on earth. That's what the Pope said that you have permission to do. And that's what laid foundations for every single moment after that. It's what laid foundations for the world as we know it today. So we like to think of it, or we often think of our problem as being centered in race. Race is only a tool in the hands of colonization. It is a modus operandi to separate and conquer a people. And so, yes, we need to overcome racial hierarchy, but ultimately, we need to decolonize. And that's what I found in this book.
Wow. Wow. So, I'm connecting the dots between what you're saying, this necessary task, and the public discourse that we're having as a
Yes.
nation
Well,
about history, right? And about which histories, whose histories we teach in classrooms.
yeah.
What of our checkered past we should commit to paper and commit to memory. Lucy, we reflect all the time on the commission about the countercultural nature of wanting to get history right, right? We're in an environment politically and socially and economically where it's to somebody's benefit that we get history wrong or that there are gaps in history. Say more about why this work of unpacking colonization, unpacking the laws that we would rather not admit were on the books. Say more about why that is so key in a time when there is a concerted effort, right, to do exactly the opposite, right, to not unpack the history, but instead to subdue it and repress it.
Well, first of all, I think that thank you for the question. That truth is really love, and the truth that you're telling in this book is an incredibly loving gift, and that when we reside in delusion and situate ourselves dependent upon delusion, that's a sickness. It's a real sickness. And so in order, like for me, as I have done my own genealogical research about my family, and have people who were enslaving other human beings in my family, it's a hard truth to know, but it's also a liberatory truth, because then it inspires and really invites making it right, and that is a liberatory path, and that is a joyful, actually a joyful path, to be in the process of opening space to hear the hard truth, to tell the hard truth, but to understand that that I'm not going to be liberated unless I'm willing to hear it and walk that path and open it and invite other white people to do the same thing. And that the tales that you tell, Lisa, in the book are so critical for our self-revelation, and for us to break through delusion, and living in delusion all the time is a very tense thing, not trying to evade it, and all of the societal constructs to avoid just the simple truth is not how I want to live my life. And I don't want, and as a community and as a country, we need to make it right. And it's a pathway towards co-liberation and towards collective joy, really.
Can I add to that?
Go ahead,
Naomi?
Lisa. Yeah.
So this is so wonderful. Can I just say, I love this group. Lucy, I love how you brought out the reality that we have a choice right now. We have a choice whether or not we allow ourselves to see or remain in delusion, right? I love how you use that. That's true. One of the things that the reason why I think the context being colonization is so important is that when we think of it as racism, we often think of it in terms of individual prejudice or wrongdoing against people. We can even think of it as systemic and structural, but then it usually is like this systemic and structural thing that happens. It's not connected to anything. It kind of floats around and hits different stuff and messes it up. And then we have to come back and fix it. But there's no source, there's no through line. When we understand race to be a modus operandi of colonization, then we understand it to be a weapon of violence, because we understand it to be something that's used in the context of war. And one of the things that has blown my mind as I've thought about it, and even honestly, as I've read through the book again, I wrote it, but you're writing it chapter by chapter. And at the end, something emerged that I didn't even plan, which was understanding that this has been since 1619 and before that, actually, since you could actually trace it to the Pequot massacres. You could actually say, and to the genocide of Native people, you can understand this, the constant drumbeat that has marched through American history has been the drumbeat of the attempt to construct, entrench, and protect white male dominance. That's the bottom line. And it's not just dominance in terms of physical power, it's dominance in terms of all power. It's dominance in terms of economic power, social power, political power, civic power. There's no corner of our legal system, our social construct, that has not at some point, and even right now, being touched, being dominated by the narrative of the supremacy of white maleness. And I say that, why do I hit on white maleness? It's because when you go back to the very first race laws, those who benefited, the only ones who benefited, were white men. The very law that ensnared Fortune herself, Fortune Game McGee, in indenture until she was 31 years old, and two successive generations of her descendants also ensnared in indenture. That first race law, it came about because white male planters were threatened by the reality that their white women, their indentured servants from Ireland and Ulster Scots, that they were falling in love and marrying enslaved Black men and having children with them. And that hit the ego, the social ego of those white male planter class, which was also the lawmakers. And it also confused the legal hierarchy of race, because now we had all these mixed race kids running around. What are they? Are they supposed to be free, indentured, or enslaved? So this is how they solved it. They could have made a decision in that moment to say, you know what? We see that there's this muddying of the racial construct that we've been trying to build. You know what we're going to do? We're going to just dismantle that thing. We're going to just have a, work for fee kind of a service. We're going to have an actual capitalist society. How about we do that? They could have done that. They didn't. Instead, what they did was they declared that any white woman who married an enslaved Black man would herself be enslaved until the death of her husband. And then her children would be enslaved in perpetuity. So who benefits there? Only the white man. And in what way does he benefit? In every single way. Because it didn't take very long, only a few years later, they look up and now white male planters are forcing their Irish and Ulster Scot indentured women to marry enslaved Black men and have children with them, because that law also added two words: in perpetuity. The children would be enslaved in perpetuity. So now they were breeding in Maryland, basically enslaved young people, or enslaved people, through forcing the marriage and forcing them to have children. And so they begged off of that. So by the time Fortune is standing in court in 1705, that's no longer the law. They said, oh, we're going to do it with this white woman enslaved thing. And they said, if your ancestry, your mother, is a white woman, you cannot be enslaved. But if your father is Black, you will definitely be indentured. That was the implication of that law. So who benefits? All the way through history, what I found in every generation, the laws and the structures that were passed, all the way up through right now, the voter suppression and voter subversion that is happening in our very state. It's happening for the benefit of white men.
Wow. So Lisa, you have this part here. I'm on page 28 of the book, and you're talking about, like you just said, this imposition of race. The race had to be constructed so that it could be used as a tool of colonization. And you say, if only the constructs of race hadn't existed, Martha might have lived, Annie might have flourished, Augustine might not have been such a monster to his children. Family fracture might not have been such a pathology on both sides of my family, meaning your family. Mm-hmm. And you talk about the cost, mm-hmm. right, of this imposition. Mm-hmm. So talk to us about, I mean, we've talked about how this work of doing genealogy, while maybe anxiety producing and distressing and for folks of African descent, it can also be just mournful. You feel helpless because you're like, I can't find, there's not much of anything there. Mm-hmm. It can be healing and liberatory, and we get to prepare. Talk about this cost, though. Talk about the cost to the bloodline of this, the weight of colonization, and talk about the cost to you going through this. I mean, you talk openly about how sometimes you just had to just weep. Yes. What you found as you were searching, doing this self-exploration that you called it earlier. Mm-hmm. What kinds of costs did you count? And Lucy, I'm going to come to you and ask you the same question after.
So, good, because it's a question for both of us, isn't it? All right. So the first time that I wept in the middle of doing the research was when I decided to figure out, why is it that in all of the cases when in the genealogy that I found that was done by Paul Heinig, Professor Paul Heinig, out of Maryland, he's actually the premier genealogist that has uncovered most of the documents that have to do with free Black families in Maryland. These are free families, by the way. We're not even talking about enslaved. We're talking about free families, right? Indentured and then free. But what I realized is that in his records about Fortune and 2 successive generations, there were never any fathers listed. They were always Fortune with her daughters and maybe her sons, Sarah with her daughters and sons, mostly sons, but they never had any fathers listed. And so I and a few other people who I shared this with were like, what's going on there? Is she in a brothel? Like, what's happening? Like, well, I decided, you know what? Why don't I do a DNA match search for the names, the surnames of her indenturing families to see if their surnames are matched with my blood. And it turns out they are. There were pages of them, pages of that surname that came up as matches in my DNA. So there's good evidence that what was happening was when Fortune was indentured, she was indentured and then used as a sex slave, likely, in addition to whatever work she had to do on the plantation or farm. But she was being used as a sex slave by the men of the family, one or more of the men of the family. And then they crafted the law so that if she got pregnant while indentured, she would have to be indentured for another 7 years. And her children would have to be indentured for 21 years if the father was white and 31 years if the father was Black. And hers were indentured for 21 years. Sarah, her daughter, also was indentured for 7 extra years. And her family, her children, were indentured for 21 years. So we know that, and both of those indenturing families, their surnames are in me. So when I realized that, I sat in it. I didn't just let the stat or the data go by. I sat in it. What would it have been like for Fortune to have to leave her daughters in the care of the indenturers who raped her? Because once her indenture is up, she has to go, but they still own her children. What must it have been like for Sarah to have to leave her children to the people who raped her? Do you hear what I'm saying? So that was the first
Wow.
time that I wept. The second time that I wept was when I realized that Lizzie Johnson, who was the daughter, the granddaughter of Leah Ballard, the last enslaved woman in our family, they were in Camden, South Carolina. They actually had been owned by people who at one point were Quakers. I don't know if they remained Quakers and still owning slaves into the 1800s, but at one point, David Ballard came down from Virginia into South Carolina, and he was a Quaker in Virginia. And they had a very large plantation. They had a lot of people. And Leah was among them. Leah had altogether 17 children, but 5 of them are never to be found on any census, likely because they were sold or gifted to family members or died in the course of being enslaved in those, her first 5 children. That made me weep. That's loss. It made me weep when I realized that Lizzie's mother died in childbirth because there were no hospitals that took Black people. So that's medical racism. That made me weep. It made me weep when I read this, or not read, but heard the story from my mother and then researched the story of Hiram Lawrence, all right, Philadelphia, who moved here to Philadelphia from Indiana, where he was escaping from Jim Crow. And he got here and he settled in Elmwood, a neighborhood in Philadelphia that has been moved since then. We think that the Elmwood that we have now is where it was. No, there was an Elmwood that was over by the airport. And that Elmwood, he owned a block of homes in that marshland area. And that neighborhood was demolished by the city of Philadelphia, claimed by eminent domain, and now sits under the I-95. And they paid him pennies on the dollar. That was land. That was our family's legacy. That was potential wealth that could have been developed, cultivated, used to pay for colleges, used to pay for homes, used for generations, used to pay for vacation. My goodness, a break. But it was taken for pennies on the dollar. And he died the same year because we believe he died of a broken heart. And he was only able to buy one home here in South Philly, 1 block from where I sit right now, with the money that they gave him for a block of homes. And that home, and that we lived in this neighborhood for 70 years. And then finally, I want to say this, that when Nixon declared his war on drugs in the 1970s, John Ehrlichman, his legislative director, confessed in 1995, and it was written about in 2004, and it's written about in the book. But he confessed that that war on drugs was not actually about drugs. It was actually for the purpose of giving pretext for Nixon to round up and break up Black communities and hippies, his 2 political foes. So for the sake of a political domination, we now go in and kill Black people by pumping drugs into their communities and round them up and take men away from their families, allow children to be grown up without fathers for one white man's political win. And not just his one, but a party's political win. And my uncle, Richie, dropped dead of a heroin overdose in the years when heroin was being pumped into this neighborhood in South Philadelphia. And my grandmother, Willa Lawrence, dropped dead in the same house 20 years later because she was beaten to death by a crack addict after crack was pumped into this neighborhood. So the cost of the domination of whiteness is not just that one policy wins over another. It has visceral impact on our families and our futures.
Wow. Somebody said in the chat, thank you, Teresa, for chiming in. There's so much pain in the family. Part of what makes this so scary, right, is this genealogy work forces us to look at the pain. Lucy, how would you describe the cost or the difficulties of doing the genealogy work in your family system?
It's been a process of divesting from delusion and delusions that have propped up my family and my own idea of myself. And I think that the stories that there was in my family, my grandmother, I would go to visit her with my brothers, and we would be there by ourselves. She lived in a big white house in Atlanta, and she taught me really explicitly the disconnections of whiteness. She had a Black housekeeper, and she would say, don't go into the kitchen. No, don't interact. And then she spent all of her time drinking beer and watching TV, and she didn't interact with us. And this is true for, I think, many white families, the disconnection of whiteness, of not having an integrated self. And we would roam around in that in that house, being fairly like emotionally abandoned in that space. And those things, those legacies are a direct result of the lies that were told that were resulted in them being able to afford that White House, in my view. And through her lineage, as when I started to do the genealogical reparative research, her great-great-grandfather was Reverend Clement Reed, who lived in Virginia, and a prominent, I think, Presbyterian minister, who in the record of his estate are listed, along with a walnut table and a chest and 13 chairs, 28 people named Harrison and Moses and Edmund. And when I saw this estate, it's the depth of that harm and the legacy of that harm and the number of all of the harm, the debt owed to the descendants, it's very, very deep, and I'm not done processing it or really grappling with it, but to me it's a depth of a debt that requires my individual reparative work, but it also requires working collectively, in community with other white people willing to face ourselves and willing to look at this. And the legacy of that disconnection is that legacy of that disconnection is collective death. Like this stuff is colonization, white supremacy is going to kill all of us on the planet. And so it's for me, the pain of that, and the pain of accepting that, and those threads still run through my family, and disconnection within my family, and in people trying to protect their idea of themselves. I mean, it's also true. It's interesting that you mentioned your Quaker, these Quakers that were involved, because I'm a Quaker, and Quakers have are so protective of their idea of themselves as well. And we were really instrumental in the development of white supremacy, because Quakers enslaved people in Barbados, and George Fox, right? And George Fox, who is the founder of Quakerism, wrote an apology and said, "Oh, well, let's just meet in meeting with those we," and like it was a way to there's a historian who says that was a radical move at the time, but it was the denial of that of God in everyone, which is a Quaker central, and that of the humanity of others. And William Penn was the first slaveholder in Philadelphia, and brought 12 people from Barbados And so like for me, like let's knock down William Penn too. Like let's be really clear about, you know, these legacies and tell the real truth of the legacies. And for me, that leads to a need for intergenerational, transgenerational restorative justice, and the truth telling leading to reparative action is essential to move us toward right relationship, toward real relationship with ourselves and with others.
You know, I'm so appreciative of the fact that we right away, and Lisa, you do it right away in the book, we connect the dots between the stories we tell about God, the stories we tell about ourselves, and what manifests as violent and harmful action, or internalized shame, right? That you either don't know, so you might internalize some shame about that, or you're believing a myth, and so that to me is also not knowing, you know, not knowing the truth.
Yeah.
Lisa, you write here that to move forward requires us to understand the depth of our brokenness. And so, you know, there's often an impulse to action. We know bad things have happened. We know people have been brutalized. We know, what do we do? Right? But you're talking about an intermediate step. Before we get to the doing, picking up the tools of repair, we have to sit with the brokenness, sit with the truth. And you talk about how the practice of humility is the first act of repair. I was so struck by this. Say more about what you mean here, that humility is actually the first step.
That's exactly right. And the book is in 3 parts. The first part is the roots of race in America, this construct. The second part is the degradation and the resistance, or the fruits. And the third part is about how to repair what race broke in the world. And the first chapter of that part of the book is on truth telling. And truth telling, it has 3 phases. You have to seek the truth, you have to listen to the truth, and then you tell the truth you heard. You tell the truth you've learned. And so the truth seeking phase requires humility. You can't engage in truth seeking if you think you know it all, if you think you've heard it all. There's actually a truth that I learned on a pilgrimage that I took to Croatia, Bosnia, and Serbia. It was a hard-won truth because it involved conflict in the group that I was in. But it was really a really odd day. We went into Serbia, and Serbia, of course, we know was kind of the locus of the Bosnian Serbian War. And it was confusion that was sown. And we see Putin doing the same thing right now in Ukraine, the exact same playbook. But what he's doing, he's sowing confusion. And it was done in the same way by Milosevic in Croatia. He sowed confusion by saying the Bosniaks started it, the Croats started it, and they started it by doing XYZ. They are committing genocide against our people. The exact same script that Putin is using right now against the Ukrainians. So when we went to Serbia, that's what we heard from the Serbians. The Croats started it. The Bosniaks started it. When we went to Bosnia, Sarajevo, we went to Croatia, they said the Serbs started it. They said everybody started it but them. The truth is the Serbs started it. Milosevic started it, in both Croatia and in Bosnia. But humility would say, for one of the people who is there on the ground, I've heard this, but I don't know it to be true. Let me listen to the one who I'm accusing. Let me listen to the one who is said to have done this action. And let me listen to their story. Let me hear more than what I know. And then I will find out. And not just listen to their story, but let's then also listen to the science. Let's then listen to the historical record. See, humility seeks the truth. It doesn't seek to be to be validated. It seeks the truth and it bows to the truth.
Wow. Yes, yes, yes. I mean, and this whole last part of the book where you're talking about these practical ways we can repair, and you talk about truth telling, you talk about the act of confession and the act of repentance. I mean, these tend to the spiritual matter, right?
Yes.
That one of the things that our commission, Lucy, we have been trying to articulate is that this is a moral mandate. This is a spiritual practice, the work of looking back, and dusting off the things we would rather not see. Talk to us about the moral mandate. What's the moral case for reparations work broadly? And also, if you want to talk about this genealogy work specifically, why should we do it from a moral perspective?
Is that for Lucy or for me?
That's for Lucy. That's for
Okay.
Lucy. I'm sorry.
No problem.
Well, because it's the way we become whole. I mean, that's the simple answer to it. It's the way that we become whole, but also like the humility that Lisa is talking about, the humility to really gain the 360-degree truth, as opposed to the truth that affirms our assumptions. And I mean, I think that so much of what white people try to do is, I want to be a good white person, and so I want to find the stories that affirm that, rather than deal with the complexity and the reality of complicity and of what that actually means in order to become whole. And I think it's a spiritual, the thing that I think is that a lot of people don't understand is that in the end, the motivation has to be responsibility and wholeness rather than guilt or shame. It's got to be, I'm coming to this place because I understand that my hands can play a role in actually moving towards repair. And that is not like coming from, that comes for me from a place of, excuse my cat, from a place of, I am a spiritual being and I want to fully embrace all of the ways that societal constructs have constrained and kept me from the truth and limited my range of motion in terms of moving forward towards my full spiritual self as a spiritual being, but also towards others, and that we don't get there alone. It's collective work. And I think it's also just like, for me as a Quaker, like the concept of the original insight of the seed, and the seed of that of God in me, the seed of that of God in everyone, that if I really believe that, then this is deep work of reclamation and restoration and truth telling, and what the truth leads us to, which is about reparative action.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Lucy.
I would love
You
to,
know,
I'd love to speak into
Yeah,
that if it's
please,
okay.
please
So
do. Please do. Yeah. Mhm.
So Lucy, I love you. I want to meet you. I want to talk about our histories and how there might be overlap and all of that. But I love the path that you've been on, because I think it is, and I love the language that you're using. The fact that what you're saying is that we need to avoid, or not just avoid, we need to renounce, quite honestly, shame. I do think that there's a place for guilt. I think there's a place for godly guilt when we realize that we have done wrong. And that's all guilt is realizing you've done wrong. But the thing is, guilt is solvable. You solve guilt by doing right. You simply turn around and do the right thing, right? That's how you absolve guilt. But shame is absolutely destructive. Shame paralyzes us. It freezes us, and that nobody needs that. Nobody wants that. It doesn't help anybody. What I would say though is that for me, the reparations, what's the most critical thing for us to understand about the reparations process, I get from the scripture. I understand it from 2 Samuel 21, 1 through 14. 2 Samuel 21, 1 through 14. David is approached by the Gibeonites about something the previous king did. King Saul did, right? So it's not even something he did. He did not have anything to do with this, but he is approached by the Gibeonites because they're like, King David, Saul tried to kill all of our people, and he wasn't supposed to do that. Now, David had just been crying out to God, God, why do we have a drought in the land? What's going on? Why do we have a drought? What's going on with the drought? And then he gets the knock on the door, and they're like, Mr. Saul did us wrong. So he has this light bulb moment. It's like bing above his head, and he says, that's why we have a drought in the land. I just love the scripture. It's so funny. And he does something that is radical. He does something I've never seen anybody do. I've never seen anybody do this. But we know how God feels about it because God blesses it. You know what he does? He could have said to them what America has said to people of African descent. He could have said, oh, I feel so bad for you. Peace. He could have just said, I'm walking. You know what I mean? Thank you for sharing. Next. That's what they've done to us. We are the only people group in American history that has never received reparations on a federal level for the oppression we suffered on this land. The only ones. Why? He could have said, I'm so sorry for you. I'm going to get my counsel and we're going to figure out what to do and we'll get back to you. And he could have done it. But I don't think he did that because if he did do that, he actually still would not be repairing what reparation is all about. It is about repairing the relationship, the relatedness to each other, because that relationship broke the moment that Saul basically took the role of God and decided that what would be the last day of those Gibeonites. He decided when their lives should end. He decided who should be in charge of this land. That wasn't God. That was Saul. And so what David did was he rectified the power dynamic in the relationship. He said, I'm going to repair the relationship here. And do you know what he did? He said, what do you think we need to do in order for things to be made well with you? And they told him, and it was costly. It was not an eye for an eye, which is interesting, but it was costly. And he did it. No questions asked. And God's response was to lift the famine, lift the drought from the land. What if we did
Lisa,
that?
this is one of my favorite stories. Like people don't talk about this story. So I got so excited. And I've never looked at it from the perspective of reparations. I totally see that. And David asks them what they want. And they didn't want bloodshed at first. They were like, you can't pay us. You don't have enough money to replace the lives that were slaughtered under Saul's rule. And I think in that story, that's a pivotal moment in the story, right? David has a choice to make. You're right that it's costly, right? And so I wonder, how can we minimize the harm? How can we reduce the harm, even in our solutions, even in our innovations as it relates to our relationships? How can we reduce harm? Because we know that harm begets more harm, right? And so thank you for that, because that was just, that's a reparation story right there. Yes, that's a reparation story. I want to ask one more question before I ask if our guests have any questions to ask you. We've been thinking about this work of reparative genealogies, which, again, let me kind of give a dictionary definition that we made up. It's not a dictionary, but a dictionary definition of reparative genealogies. it's this work of investigating the ancestral and historical links to white supremacy, to racism, to colonization. And I think that this work can be done at the organizational level. We've been talking about that as a commission. So if we think about what we can do on our own family trees, what kinds of work, what kinds of looking back can we do toward truth-telling, toward healing? How can organizations and congregations do this work? I mean, what's that work look like when you're not maybe the one, if you're not in charge at your organization, but you think this is something that your org needs to be doing, right? We've talked about various religious groups that probably need to do some confession and truth-telling, right? How do groups engage in this work, Lisa?
I think it's a really great question. We're actually working right now with the Carter Center and developing a program to help different evangelical denominations, and not just denominations, but also organizations and institutions to begin to do the work of truth-telling. And I think that what you do, it's one thing to do it as an individual church. Some churches have that long history and also have the resources to do that. For example, St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Richmond, Virginia, has been doing that kind of a truth-telling journey for actually, I think, a few decades now. This is the same church that that General Lee and Jefferson Davis both attended. This same church. It's also the church that after the Civil War, around the turn of the 20th century, the vestry is the one that came up with the idea of redlining in Virginia, right? The vestry of that church. And so, but they didn't know that until they went through the vestry meeting minutes, and they realized, oh my gosh, this is where the idea began here in Virginia. And so I think that there is a truth seeking journey that our institutions need to begin to go on with regard to their own complicity, their own benefit, and their own action within the to protect the constructs of white supremacy. It's a simple question. It's two simple questions. How have we been a part of the problem? How did we contribute to bringing our nation to the place where it is? How did we contribute to the problem of the supremacy of whiteness in America? Legally, socially, economically, civically, politically. Second, how have we been benefactors if we have not contributed altogether, right? And the third question is, who specifically has suffered as a result in our community, in our actual churches, in our actual churches' communities? Who has paid the cost for our complicity? Sorry, that's my dog. Hold on. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Lucy, got anything you want to add to that question around
Well,
how
I
we
think
get
that-
groups and
Yeah, I mean, I think this is really elemental work that that should be spreading all over the country, all over. What our plan is to spread it through all the congregations in Philadelphia as much as possible, to white congregations. And I think that the piece about the asking what will repair this and holding oneself accountable to that which others will offer, those who were harmed offer, is really, really critical. And that our idea of what would be helpful is never going to match up with what would actually be requested. And I think that's very, very important. And at Green Street Meeting, we have a reparations committee, and we budgeted $50,000 a year for 10 years towards reparations. And the Black members of the community in Germantown and of the meeting are deciding what that is going to be. And even though we don't trace all of our specific complicity, situated where we are in Germantown, we are complicit and understand ourselves to be. And so the first project is a legal clinic and support for fines to secure Black Germantown wealth, so that it's not taken by eminent domain, and like so that it can't be taken by the tangled titles and reverse mortgages and all of the systemic stuff that exists to do that. And so I think that there's but I think that really humbling oneself to ask what is needed for repair. For white folks, that's a very, very important step. And teaching ourselves, I mean, in many cases, people need to learn that humility and really practice it, learn to practice it.
Can I add one last piece here?
Yeah, please do.
The reason
please
why
do.
that's so important is because that is what brings the relationship back into proper balance. It is the recognition of and the bowing to the image of God in the other.
Yes. There's nothing, that's where we should end. That's it. That's the benediction, right? I am so grateful. Go ahead, Lisa, I want you to tell us all the things.
Yes, thank you so much. I
Yes,
appreciate
yes.
that. I actually want to tell you all the things, but I want to start with reading the last page of the book, if you don't mind.
Sure.
I'd love to read this last section because people often ask me, what do you hope, what do you hope will come from this book? This is what I hope. There are two paths set before the oppressed. One path leads to rage, compounded pain, sickness, and death. The other leads to the beloved community. On that road, there is truth seeking, truth listening, truth telling. There is reparation and equity, and there is mercy, release. For the sake of my body and soul and the bodies and souls of my family's descendants to the 10th generation from me, I choose the beloved community. For readers in European bodies, you also have a choice. You can continue war for supremacy against the image of God on earth. You can resist God's beloved community, resist truth, resist equity, resist justice, and resist mercy. You can try to maintain your space at the top of a crumbling racial hierarchy. You won't be there long. You are already in the global minority. Within one generation, you'll be in the minority in the US as well. And when that day comes, you can wage war, or you can lean into truth, lean into repentance and repair, and allow yourselves to be released, forgiven. Only then can we find a new way of being together in the world. I can almost hear my 7th great grandmother, Fortune Game McGee, who walked this land 10 generations ago and absorbed the wrath of its first race, gender, and citizenship laws into her traumatized body. In my mind's ear, I hear her whisper, "Yes, child, yes."
Wow. Y'all got to go get this book. Listen, I just put the link in the chat. For those of you who are watching us on social media, go to lisasharonharper.com/fortune. It's Black Fortune Month, y'all. And we've got Philadelphia's own Lisa Sharon Harper here.
Yes, that's right.
Giving us this tool, right? Full of beautiful stories that help model for us how mining our own histories can give us new stories to tell, a new narrative, right? A new truth. And the truth is the only thing that sets us free. Thank you so much, Lisa. You all can check out Lisa at lisasharonharper.com. Also on the social media, check her out on Twitter, on Instagram, on Facebook. Go pick up Fortune today. Thank you so much, Lucy. You'll hear more from Lucy and the Mayor's Commission on Faith-Based and Interfaith Affairs as we continue this reparations work in 2022. We are serious, y'all. So please follow Faith PHL on social media so you'll know the next time the commission is hosting another conversation. This is being recorded, and so this will go out to everybody who registered. Thank you all so much. Have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you and be well. Thank you all so much.